slides whenever you get the chance.
Okay. Okay, I guess we can start, right? Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. I don't know if people are coming in or not, but hopefully they are.
Yes. Bonjour à vous toutes et tous. Hello, everyone. On behalf of the Center for Research on Language and Cultural Contact at Glendon College, I would like to welcome you all to the conversation with the group Black Ox Orkestar and Rokhl Kafrissen. But before we start, I would like to remind that just yesterday, the 80th anniversary of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising was commemorated. It was the largest act of Jewish resistance against the German occupiers during the World War II. Klezmer music not only symbolizes Jewish resilience, but is also part of rebuilding lost Jewish culture, as 90% of klezmer performers died in the Holocaust. So before turning the floor over to our guest, to you, let me introduce Rokhl Kafrissen, who will be moderating the conversation. Rokhl Kafrissen is a New York-based cultural critic and playwright and winner of the 2022 Adrian Cooper Dreaming in Yiddish Prize. She has been writing about modern Yiddish culture since 2005, when her ruthless cosmopolitan column began in Jewish Currents. Her Rokhl's Golden City column began appearing in Tablet in 2017, covering new Yiddish culture in all its iterations. Her op-eds regularly appear in newspapers all over the world. She was a 2019-2020 40th Street Wailaba Fellow, for which she wrote Shomer Shabbos, Silent Sabbath, a Black comedy about the dangers of ethnography and human experimentation. Merci beaucoup à tout le monde. Thank you. And over to you, Rokhl.
Hey, merci beaucoup. I'm so glad to be here with everyone. What a great opportunity. And I think we're going to have a really nice time. I'm going to take the prerogative of the conversation moderator and actually start the conversation reading to you just a brief snippet of something that I wrote probably in 2002, and it's about something that happened at the very end of 2001. And it's going to set the scene a little bit for the conversation that we're going to have. In 2001, I was a law student in New York, and I had been attending Klez Canada, which is...
Rokhl, can I just interrupt you and just ask Sandra to stop sharing the screen so we can really focus on what you're saying? That would be amazing. Thank you so much, Sandra. Great, let's hear that again.
So in 2001, I was a law student in New York City, but I had many friends in Montreal because I had started attending Klez Canada, which is a end of summer arts retreat that happens in the Laurentian Mountains. So for a lot of New Yorkers, Klez Canada is really their sort of introduction and their way of connecting to Montreal, and especially Montreal's Jewish community. And certainly for me, that I've learned a lot about the community from attending Klez Canada and meeting people there, and really I'm falling in love with the city. I mean, I adore Montreal. So in 2001, in December, I guess it was, winter break. So I was visiting, and there was something called the Kishif Kartoffel Cabaret that happened at the Sala Rosa in Montreal, which is, for a New Yorker, again, it's like one of these cool sort of iconic music venues that, you feel very hip and in the know to go to. So when I came home, I wrote this piece about what happened that evening. So I'm just going to read you a tiny little bit. We're all munching on latkes and wondering what the next act, Black Ox Orkestar, is going to sound like. Instead of the whole band coming on, one guy comes out in a white shirt and a black vest. No one is quite sure if this is a solo number or what. His name is Gabriel Levine, and he's a member of the Orkestar. And before they take the stage, he has a few words to say. He begins by acknowledging the fact that we are gathered in honor of the festival of Hanukkah, also known to normal people as Hanukkah. He draws the familiar in Yiddishist circles comparison of cultures, diasporic Yiddish on the one side and sui generis Israeli on the other. Levine feels that diasporic Yiddishist culture is more dynamic, being that it is less programmatic than Israeli. It has no goals to meet, no agenda to move forward. More to his point, diasporic culture is not a tool of Israeli militarism. At this point, an older gentleman calls out from the audience, "I thought I was supposed to be listening to music here." Gabe has been expecting this and coolly replies, "We're getting to that, sir." That boy gets an A in respecting his elders. He continues reading from a piece of paper as a few older members of the audience leave noisily. He again calls on the integrity of diasporic and Yiddish culture and the resilience and resistance within those traditions. He asks us to draw on that alternative tradition and to stand up for what is right, to end the injustices committed against Palestinians and to end the occupation. With that, the rest of the band joins him on stage and rips into their first number, Wer tanzt dort, who was dancing there, an original song written in Yiddish by Levine about armed conflict in Israel. Okay, so those are my reflections from over 20 years ago. Did I have that correct? Actually, what, Gabe, did you write Wer tanzt dort?
No, that's Scott's, of course.
Scott. Okay, I thought I had it wrong. I
Mm-hmm.
didn't know you guys then, and I don't think I had the album at that. Well, you hadn't recorded the album, right?
No, it was a few years before our first record. I also have to say, I really don't think I was wearing a vest, but memories.
I'm quite certain you were wearing a vest.
Shonda.
Intriguing. We're already starting. There's a machloikas here. Perhaps there were photos. Maybe we'll find out. So that was December 2001, and it ended up being a very interesting and rather memorable night, although Gabe's wardrobe choice is not necessarily that memorable. But there was quite a stir among audience members, with ultimately various audience members demanding their own stage time to explain themselves and talk about their own circumstances. And it was very interesting. So fast forward now, the band ended up recording 2 albums and then disbanding and everybody going off to their own projects, and for some people having careers. And then it's December 2022, over 20 years later, and all of a sudden, Black Ox Orkestar was back on stage. They had reunited and put out this new album. I now was seeing them in Brooklyn at Union Pool, which is a little bit like Sala Rosa in that it's extremely hip. It doesn't have the same kind of history, but it's this very cool club here in Brooklyn. And it was a real trip for me because all of a sudden, 20 years later, most of the people in the audience were far younger than myself. Where did the time go? Okay. So we're going to play a song from this new album. We're taking you from Sala Rosa in 2001 now to 2022. This new album came out, and we're going to hear the song Rokhl.
So go ahead, Sandra, and you can play the first video.
It's really fantastic.
Oh, we just lost it. This song is called Rokhl, which means echo in Yiddish. And it's really just about losing people and finding them again and accepting them as you find them.
Rokhl, ich such mein Rokhl. Du bist gewesen mit mir, Amor. Also ich fremde wie ein weiten Glas. Und irgendwie ein letzten Tanz. Where did you go? Mal wiederkommen. Ain't nothing left here but an echo. You sound the same, but so far away. And I remember when you went away. Wiederkommen, wiederkommen. Every Esther, every Harmon, oh, everything we have in common, oh, every exiled and lost soul, we'll be together in a Wiederkoll. Where did you go? Oh, my Wiederkoll. Ain't nothing left here but an echo. You sound the same, but so far away. And I remember when you went away.
Okay. So we're now going to jump back again in time. That was 2022. That was from the newest album. I feel a little bit like a disc jockey. I love this. But now we're going to hear from the band members themselves. And I want you to take us back in time to 2001, or actually the turn of the last century, even before 2001. And I want you guys to tell me a little bit about the origin story of the band, what the music scene in Montreal was like at that time, and your participation in it, and any connections you had, or what your sort of relationship was to the klezmer revival at that time. So you can choose to answer any of those questions or all of them if you feel like it.
Great questions. I want to say also, like, as we're talking, anybody who's listening in to this webinar, feel free to pop questions in the Q&A and we will see them. And if they seem like things that we want to bounce ideas off of, we will definitely answer them. But maybe I should go first since I'm talking already. But I guess, well, where would I start? You know, I was living in Montreal in the 90s. I was a student at McGill University studying theater. I ended up apprenticing with the Bread and Puppet Theater in Vermont, where I spent quite a bit of time over a couple of years as a kind of full-time puppeteer and musician. I was playing saxophone at the time. And there I met people who really kind of changed the course of my life, including Jenny Romaine, who's just a powerhouse in the kind of Yiddishist and theater worlds. And he really just introduced me to this music that I hadn't really been that familiar with. Although, fun fact, the Flying Bulgar Klezmer Band of Toronto actually had their first paid gig at my bar mitzvah. So I definitely had some kind of klezmer music in my background, but it hadn't really occurred to me to be particularly interested in it until folks at Bread and Puppet kind of turned me on to it, including Jenny and a clarinet player there named Mike Romanishin, who was a terrific clarinet player who played some klezmer. So I switched to clarinet. And then also something I found at Bread and Puppet that was kind of lacking in the Montreal music scene that I was a part in was social music. I felt like there wasn't, you'd go see shows and you'd go see bands and it was great, but somehow there wasn't the same kind of possibility for music to just permeate everyday life as, musicking, as Christopher Small, the great musicologist, called it, just where it's, something you do with other people to make life more beautiful and wonderful. So I kind of thought, well, coming back to Montreal after Bread and Puppet, maybe I could put some musicians together, some I knew, some I didn't know, and start a project that kind of married some of the post-punk energy in music in Montreal that we were involved in at the time with this Jewish traditional music, going back to, music from pre-war Europe and how weird and interesting it sounded. So to try to mush those things together in an interesting way.
Great. And I just want to add that Jenny Romaine, who you met at Bread and Puppet, she is also a teacher at Class Canada. So she's very much, involved in all these nodes of culture. Okay.
Yeah, and I'll just say briefly that after, meeting her, she turned me on to this whole world. I ended up going to Class Camp in the Catskills in 1999, I think. And then Class Canada the following year. And so sort of immersing myself a little bit in that kind of klezmer revival world.
And then you're better at the origin story than I am, but was it Scott first, me second, or vice versa?
No, I think it was you first. I think you
Yeah.
and Gabe played in Paris.
Under the bridge. Yeah. Gabe and I have known each other since we were kids. Through family connections. Our parents are good friends. We celebrated Hanukkahs together and sometimes Pesach together. We lived in the same neighborhood of Toronto, although our kid social circles were different, but our family social circles were the same. So it felt like cousins almost, like the kids you'd see, Gabe and his brother and me and my sister, and we'd celebrate over the years. And but this was sort of our first coming together as independent adults. Why were you in Paris?
I was learning French and visiting my girlfriend at the time. And where were you doing there?
I was learning French, and I was having one of those very lucky privileged moments where I finished high school and was planning to move to Montreal, and in between the two. No, that's not true.
No, it was later, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, never mind.
Yeah.
Anyway, why was I in Paris? Because it doesn't matter. Anyway, we saw each other there, and you had your clarinet and I had a violin, not my real violin, but a travel violin. And I was schlepping it all over the place. And we met under the bridge, and you had started looking into these songs. And it was a moment where, for me, Jewish music, I wouldn't have even called it klezmer music until then, really, had played a part in my life in a very kind of beautiful, simple family way, in that my Bubby and Zeta would listen to it. And they all spoke Jewish. That's what they called it. They all grew up in Montreal speaking Yiddish. And my father's mother was the vice principal of Jewish People's School in Montreal. And so there was a whole community of Anglo Jews that many had moved to Toronto. So they had sort of transplanted their community there. And they all grew up with a tradition of playing music together, like musicking, what you were talking about. And I grew up with that in my midst. But when it came to Jewish music, there was something always about it that transported me, even when I was really little. Like I knew which was my bubby's favorite folk song, and I just thought it was the most romantic, beautiful thing, but I had never really considered it being something I could do. But I think what Gabe was describing as social music, it's apparent so quickly that if you respond to the chord progressions, or if you have something in there where that type of mode belongs to you somehow, is the only way I can imagine, then you too can join in. You too can play this. And since all my music training was out the window by then, and everything I did, I just learned by ear. I felt like I could be there with you immediately, and was immediately into the idea of bringing this into my life. And yeah, you made it happen.
And so then when I got back to Montreal in like the summer of 2000, through a mutual friend, I think Mark Slutsky, he was like, oh, you got to meet this guy, Scott, who's playing, Yiddish klezmer music around town. And Scott, you could take it from here.
So yeah, so I'm originally from Baltimore, and I was doing undergrad at McGill, and I grew up. So musically, I was like playing in the emo hardcore scene in Baltimore, and was doing like indie folk. It was the '90s. It was like that was the music that was around. And when I was 14, I played in a ska band, and my only real exposure to playing any Jewish music at all was doing a ska version of Hava Nagila that was like a true crowd pleaser. But it's kind of like what Jessica said, that there is something extremely social and infectious about it. And anyway, so I grew up in a mixed household. My mom's Jewish, and she speaks a kind of I think many baby boomers had a sort of passive understanding of Yiddish. Like her bubby never fully mastered English, and so she was never taught Yiddish, but she was spoken to in Yiddish. And so in our household, it became like the language of excited utterances. So if the cat was throwing up, my mom's knee-jerk response was to shout something in Yiddish to my father, who doesn't understand a word of what she's saying. But I'd get yelled at in Yiddish, and jokes would be told in Yiddish. And so it was just sort of, it was part of my family life without me even really thinking too much about it. But when I was at McGill, I, sophomore year, noticed that the Jewish Studies program at McGill taught Yiddish. And I thought, that's so cool. And I already know a bit of this language. And I never really thought to me to study it. But I signed up and absolutely just fell in love with the program, partly because it was like education with a purpose. It was like mission driven, right? It was like you were learning Yiddish, the alphabet and the grammar and everything was like a quest to save something and preserve something and discover something that was so buried. And I had no idea that there was this depth of like Yiddish literature and Yiddish modernism and political movements and everything. And so I thought this was just like a good language for jokes, but it's so much more than that. And in the course of that, I discovered, Yiddish folk music. Like I had heard records like the Berry Sisters or things like that, but I had never heard, deep, weird archival recordings out of Ukraine in like the 1920s. But I spent a lot of time in the music library at McGill, just digging through these old recordings, and was just absolutely blown away by them. And they resonated. At the time I was really interested in American folk music and playing like sort of old-timey backwoods Appalachian stuff on the guitar and mandolin. And was just immediately drawn to it. It just made complete sense to be playing Yiddish folk music. And then that became a focus of my studies. And then in Montreal, I moved to Montreal. I didn't really know anybody there. It took me a while to make any musician friends, but I ended up becoming friends with Josh Dolgan, who of course is now so-called Yiddish superstar. Josh was playing accordion then and totally into klezmer music. And we met up with a few other friends, and Brana Levy, who's a Yiddish folk singer and theater performer in Montreal. And we started a band called Die Luftmenschen. And it was just like classic Yiddish folk tunes, like out of the songbooks. But it was really, really fun. And we did like a regular night at a local bar. And that's how I started developing how to play klezmer music. And I just taught myself on a mandolin and guitar and eventually a little squeeze box accordion concertina. And then I don't remember exactly how it happened, but yeah, our mutual friends introduced us, and it was just one of these sort of miracle moments where the three of us had just converged right at the same time into discovering this music that I think meant something a little bit different to each of us, but resonated in this really deep way.
And this was all converging in 2001.
2000, I guess, like, yeah, summer 2000 was when we just had this, I just recall this like very idyllic summer, of youth playing in Scott's apartment overlooking Parc Jean Mance, in the mountain in Montreal. We were just like out in his balcony and just playing. Like, I don't know how we did that. Like, we just played constantly. Like, it was just like one nonstop jam session, at least for that summer.
Basically,
the fall.
Rent was cheap. But let's not get any idea that I had a beautiful balcony facing the park. It cost me nothing.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if we mentioned though, all of us were, Scott did, but Gabe and I both had been playing in bands in Montreal and sort of knew each other as well through that circuit of playing shows. Yeah. And at a time, maybe I would have been going to a rock show 2 or 3 times a week, whatever it was on. And the community, the Montreal Anglo musician community is quite small. So it really, already there was this feeling of community. If you didn't know the person directly, you knew someone who knew the person if they were a musician. So we had all also had quite a bit of band experience. I think part of the joy was, this is not amps in a crummy jam space in a basement. This is something you can play like this, like in a living room, like on a balcony. And there are these tunes. And yeah, I don't want to skip over the joy of discovery because this was pre-internet. And it occurred to me, Rokhl, you said at the beginning, what was Gabe wearing? Maybe there are photos. There aren't photos of that time. There aren't really, like, not everything was documented. Not everything was posted somewhere already. You can't go back. Actually, we tried when we first initiated our reunion. Part of the first project, which we'll talk about later, was looking through archival stuff. And apart from the things that we personally own, there actually aren't that many documents of that time. And at the time, there was no other way to find ancient, beautiful music recorded like that, except to go to the music library, except to sort of like share it on cassette. And, remember walking around with my like Sony cassette Walkman, recording our rehearsals and stuff like that. So it feels like a different time in all sorts of ways.
Oh, for sure. In fact, I had a follow-up question, which is, Scott, you mentioned like going into the McGill music archives and library and looking for older archival recordings. Do you recall, or do the three of you recall any other kinds of like recordings that you got your hands on, whether they were, like a Belf or some of the tapes that Kurt Bjorling used to circulate? I'm curious if you remember anything that you were listening to as the band was coming together.
I mean, that's exactly it. Like Kurt Bjorling, who is this, this clarinet player who was playing in Brave Old World. Was that his band? Yeah. And I had taken workshops with him at Klez Camp, and he had started making these dubbed cassettes of old 78s, basically. Like that was his kind of contribution to disseminating this music. So you get one of these cassettes with like just a photocopied colored paper label of like Belf's Romanian Orchestra, for example, which was like this incredibly weird band, from recording in like the 1910s. And just this music didn't sound like anything else. Like it sounded so weird and so interesting and like so much melismatic, like sliding all over the place, and the time was all odd, and it just was endless source of inspiration. So we definitely learned a bunch of tunes from that repertoire.
There's a question in the chat, Scott, the name of the band that you had before, I'm not sure what this is referring to, but is this, maybe they mean the band that you were in with Brana?
Yeah, I played with Brana and Josh Dolgan and a few other people around Montreal.
Die Luftmenschen.
Die Luftmenschen.
So you could gloss that term maybe.
Oh, so what is a Luft? So a Luftmensch is it means air person, literally, and it's a sort of a idiomatic Yiddish expression for somebody that lives off the air. Like there's a roustabout, somebody that has no means of making a living. What on earth do they live off of? Somehow they just scrape by. But it also kind of has a connotation of somebody who's just sort of happy-go-lucky and manages to get through life somehow.
And Isabel Fry asks, did you have similar experiences with archival recordings of singers, or did you hear any field recordings of singing, Yiddish singing?
Yeah, so that's, I think my path on that started with some of the recordings that are on Smithsonian Folkways, going back to like the 50s and early 60s. Oh, I'm blanking on the name of it. There's this one record I was obsessed with, songs from the Warsaw Ghetto.
Oh,
I can't remember the name, but he was a rabbi. He was a survivor from Abraham.
Not Abraham Berman. It's a lovely album. The whole thing was on YouTube for a while, and then it was.
Oh,
taken.
really?
Yeah.
Well, so that's the type of thing. I just stumbled on it. I mean, I knew Smithsonian Folkways because again, I came from like an old-timey folk music background, and so I'm digging through this stuff and finding like, weird old Yiddish things in the back catalog of Smithsonian Folkways. And one of them is this incredible collection. It's at the same time that I'm like studying Yiddish and studying Yiddish poetry. And so I'm just learning the songs and I'm digging into the lyrics and I'm understanding the phrasings of it, and also like just sort of help learning more Yiddish and literary Yiddish through the lyrics and through studying the folk music and compositions. But and I found other records, but there wasn't, again, it was just very hard to find music back then. It really was. And I didn't have the benefit of like Kles Camp or Kles Canada at that time. I didn't have any mentors. I mean, literally it's just something I discovered by digging around in the music library. And it was only eventually I started meeting other people. And at the time I wasn't even like, I was vaguely aware that there was like the klezmatics, but I wasn't like listening to a lot of contemporary klezmer music. I wasn't really plugged into the revival in any way. And it was only when I started meeting other people like Josh and Brana, and then we had like a little Yiddish reading circle where we read Yiddish texts together and like old Yiddish anarchist Bundes texts and things like that. And then I started connecting more and realizing that I wasn't just this isolated weirdo reading this stuff, that there was actually a whole community that was doing this and had been doing this for years. And so then I attended Kles Canada and met Michael Alpert and a whole bunch of other people in doing klezmer revival and Yiddish folk revival, and was able to meet German Goldenstein, this amazing clarinetist, Moldavian Jewish clarinetist. And so that's, but the thing too was that, we learned a lot of Yiddish songs out of the songbooks. And that's true for some of the Black Ox repertoire came from Baragovsky, without even hearing any recordings of it and not finding stuff on YouTube. It's just literally like going through, and sometimes I'd be more interested in the lyrics and then trying to match up the lyrics with where's the sheet music for this, and sometimes the melodies aren't that interesting, and all of a sudden it's like, whoa, this is a gorgeous melody, but it was something I'd never actually heard recorded. And of course there are recordings out there, but this was back in the days when like this stuff was not just like a Google search away. It's almost surreal when we've started up again how easy it is to find repertoire. Like you're flooded with it. And now there's so many versions. It's like if you go on YouTube, you'll find so many bands from all around the world doing different versions of a song. And you're like, wow, why should I even bother doing another cover of this tune?
Well, so now I want to ask, where did you get the inspiration or, the confidence or the chutzpah, right, to start writing your own material as you did for the 2001 Kishif Kartoffel Cabaret? Like, how did that happen?
It's just chutzpah.
Yeah, pure chutzpah. It's just honestly like sometimes you have to be a true novice to be bold enough to do something, right? If I knew how bad I was at Yiddish, I never would have started writing. But I mean, I think part of it was wanting to also say something contemporary, because I think all of us shared like a bit of discomfort in not wanting to be a historical reenactment band. What was interesting to us, because we were all musicians playing other types of music, and so I think what we really wanted to do was to make a Jewish music band that was just a contemporary band. It was not a revival band, wasn't self-consciously a klezmer band. It was a band that's focused on how we sound as musicians and what our influences are and what we can do together in collaborating. And I think that's also kind of the difference between, sitting around in a living room and playing tunes out of a songbook or that you learn off a tape, and that's great and that's awesome, and that was like a huge part of what we did, and we could have just continued doing that and never become Black Ox. I think becoming Black Ox was to say, let's actually try to create something new, based on all the skills and experience and knowledge that we've gathered through learning this folk music. And then so part of it was like wanting to do song settings to poems. So like Toitza Goyas and Chanelin, and the first Black Ox record was Itzik Pfeffer poem that is sort of weird and haunting, but also very repetitious. And it's the rhythm in it really lends itself to music. And I think it was also, for me personally, a way of almost like psychologically hiding behind Yiddish. I could say anything. Most people have no idea what I'm talking about. And it just sounds like this interesting language. And so I didn't have to be shy and self-conscious if I just wrote something in this idiom that practically no one's ever going to understand. And they're just going to think it sounds interesting. And
Okay,
so it was like kind of liberating, I think, to do that. And then, and then a couple of people I talked to about it were like, wow, I haven't heard a new Yiddish song. Like, it was just, that was a rare thing. And I think even for people that didn't appreciate our politics or our weird, like using distorted violin and free jazz noise components of our music, still really appreciated that we were trying to build something new, and write new material and write original works in Yiddish. I think that was,
And vice
so it was a
versa.
head scratcher. I think that was a head scratcher for a lot of people.
What did you say, Jessica?
I was just going to say, and vice versa. I think that people who did appreciate the distorted violin and the weird jazz elements sort of got drawn into this world from the other direction and become fascinated by it. And that's
right. Because just to also give another important piece of the band, which was like that summer into the fall, we were like, okay, we definitely need a bass player, partially because I think we were listening to a lot of, Roma music and music that had this kind of like heavy bowed bass. We had a sense like this would like anchor the band. So we, after auditioning some people, including some famous people who I won't mention, we met this guy, Terry Amar, who at the time was playing in this band, Godspeed You Black Emperor, which was just becoming this kind of juggernaut in the kind of indie post-rock world. And he just really gelled with us instantly and just had that kind of like gravity and intensity that we were looking for. And then I think, partially through Terry's work with Godspeed and his studio work too, like studio recording became like a very important part to what we were doing. And that it wasn't just about, making music and then trying to set up some microphones and hope we captured what we sounded like in a living room. Like it somehow going into the studio to make a record became this kind of like crucible where the sound was transformed into something really interesting to us as a kind of listening experience. And then with Constellation, getting excited about the project, our record label, like Jessica was saying, like all of a sudden this music was like getting out there, to indie rock fans who had no idea about Jewish music or the klezmer revival, and who maybe were hearing this kind of stuff for the first time and digging it.
And for a first album, it really does have a cohesive sound and a point of view. It's very strong in that way.
I want to get to the question that was, I don't know, Rokhl, like if you can see the question that's being asked right now, which is really interesting.
Okay, I'll read it out loud. Did the fact that the Jewish left is much more visible and hopefully numerous and powerful than it was in the early 2000s make writing this new album a different experience than your first two?
Are we ready to go to that now, do you think? Or do you want to hold it?
I want to hold that because
Yeah.
I wanted to play, I thought this was a good moment to play the clip that had the recording from 2004, along with a little bit of Scott's interview from 2004. So let's just hold on that question for a few minutes. We're going to go to this video and then we'll talk a little bit more about this. Is that okay?
Okay, so we know the video is choppy, so forgive us, but this is a really wonderful archival clip of us playing in 2004 in a kind of sweltering night in Boston. And there's this there was this music magazine at the time, Brainwashed, and the guy videoed the concert and also videoed Scott doing an interview. And we think it's like, it sums up our kind of existence at that time really perfectly. So
Also
Sandra,
one of the rare documents of that time.
yeah, there's like no video of us playing except for this, basically. So go ahead, Sandra, and play the second video.
Unfortunately, Scott is not wearing a vest.
Yes, and Sandra, when you play, can you just make it full screen and move the cursor so we don't see the cursor on the video? Thanks.
Scott's not wearing, he's not wearing much.
Yes.
Be warned.
We definitely do attract people who have never heard klezmer music before, partly because of our involvement in other bands like Godspeed, Silver Mount Zion, and Sackville. So, people are curious what, these, indie rockers are doing with this music that seems unfamiliar to, a lot of people. At the same time, I would say, yeah, we are trying to, there is something educational to what we're doing, like it is basically a lost art form. And part of our mission is saying, this is beautiful music coming out of a really interesting tradition that disappeared. And it disappeared because of, because essentially of 20th century politics, because of the nature of assimilation and shame about ethnicity in North America, and obviously because of, the rise of fascism, Nazism, and nationalism in general in Europe. At the same time, the rise of Jewish nationalism that was associated with Israel and Hebrew culture kind of looked down on Yiddish culture as something, that came out of the ghetto, that was a bit shameful. It was like the culture of victims. So a lot of people didn't want to pass it on. So that's why a lot of kids that had Yiddish-speaking parents or grandparents never learned it, because it was considered kind of a badge of shame. So for a lot of people, for a lot of young Jews maybe that were weaned on, the culture of singing Israeli folk songs that are maybe 20 years old, or 40 years old at that, and having never really been exposed to Yiddish folk culture that goes back hundreds of years, we feel like, we want to correct that in some ways. We want to say, there are more options out there, especially for Jews living in the diaspora, that we don't have to accept a monoculture. We don't have to say that this is the new Jewish state and its culture is all of our culture, because that basically goes against the grain of Jewish history.
Yeah.
Ah, that was so good. I really, you know what, we had talked about cutting that video a little bit shorter, but it was such a joy to watch. And I think a good introduction to the next couple of questions that I want to take on, and as the host's prerogative first, I want to ask Scott, in between 2001 and 2004, so the video is 2004, right? Where did you pick up cymbal? How did that happen? I want to talk a little bit about, you know, going to Class Canada, going to Class Camp, you know, how your Jewish and musical identities for all of you sort of start really intersecting here and getting funneled into this project. But first, the cymbal. This is very important. And that's the instrument that Scott was playing. I guess it's also called a hammered dulcimer or a cimbalom. So tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I probably first encountered the cymbal. I mean, I'd heard it on recordings, but I first saw it in person at Class Canada. I don't remember who would have been playing it. Yeah, I mean, it's this ethereal sounding instrument. It sounds like it's just not of the modern world, and it's not. It's like a precursor of a piano. And I grew up, I mean, as a little kid, I played piano, and then I switched to percussion. And so it's just hitting strings with sticks was sort of the perfect thing for me. And I had no idea how to get my hands on one, right? It's much easier now to figure out how to get them these days, and there are actually people that make them in North America. But back then I was like, no clue how in the world I would get my hands on one. And I managed to find the one that was in that video, which is actually a Bukharian Uzbek version of it. It's called a chang, but it was a Sovietized version of the chang, so it had a different tuning system, and it had damper pedals, which is what the Eastern European cimbalom introduced to it. So it's this sort of perfect mishmash hybrid instrument, which is just great for Black Ox. And I don't know, I just taught myself how to play it. I literally had no idea how to tune it. I didn't know what notes to tune it to. I just kind of made it up and prayed for the best.
And then did you take it, once you started playing it, did you take it to Class Canada or one of, you know, a place where you could learn with other cymbal players?
No. It's just totally just self-taught. I mean, I just learned from listening to recordings.
Gotcha. So I want to talk a little bit about, you know, your Jewish identity, going to these places and connecting to the larger klezmer world. And also, you know, the things that you spoke about in the video from 2004 were, you know, on the one hand, to me, seem very normal, you know, very, these are the kinds of realizations that you come to once you start as a young person in this time and place, right? You come to these conclusions about, well, why was Yiddish hidden from me? Where did it go? Why is it so denigrated? And so it's kind of a familiar script, but at the same time, once you come to those conclusions, it can put you into conflict with many of the institutions around you, as you know, hinted at in the excerpt from 2001 that I read. So maybe if you guys can talk a little bit about that journey and the steps along the way.
Gabe, do you want to go?
Well, I guess maybe I would answer that by going to, because I do want to answer some audience questions. I would maybe go to this question of does the fact that the Jewish left is much more visible and hopefully numerous and powerful than it was in the early 2000s make the new album a different experience? And I would just say yes, as a way of talking about that time, you know, which again, pre social media, pre much of the internet, it was very easy to feel quite isolated in that way. We were, you know, I would say we were on the left politically, in general, but it wasn't through Yiddish that we came to kind of more anti-establishment, anti-capitalist politics. You know, Scott and I know we're going out to demonstrate at various summits as part of the, you know, anti-globalization movement, as it was now seemingly bizarrely called at the time. You know, we were basically for, you know, wanting to work in solidarity with people who we felt like were getting the short end of the stick globally, you know, who were having a hard time. And then when we were just forming, you know, it was right around the time of the Second Intifada. things were really clearly not good in Israel and Palestine. Ariel Sharon like provoked basically a whole social movement to emerge, and we wanted to be on the side of the people who we thought were really oppressed in that situation, like in Israel and Palestine, to the point that we got involved playing shows for Palestinian refugees, like benefit shows, and other Algerian refugees as well. Scott and I were part of a puppet theater company that toured in the West Bank and East Jerusalem and in Israel in 2003. So it felt like this is what we can do in a way, like we can play this music that's so Jewish, that's like 100%, or not 100% as we could say, 67% Jewish music, but singing in Yiddish, with original songs in Yiddish, like obviously totally committed to Jewish identity, but to put forward a diasporic identity, to say like, we want to create culture that's not tied to any state, and to have it exist on its own terms. But at the time, like I felt like that put us in a really challenging position, and it was extremely painful in some ways to be so isolated. And we've heard later, like, oh well, those records were really important to people. They said things that were not being said widely at the time. But I think we all were under a lot of strain because of that, and I do feel like it's one of the things that contributed to the band's dissolution. Like back in 2006, was just a lot of psychic stress from taking that position. Whereas now, when we got back together, I'll just segue to that story because we're closing, in 20 minutes apparently. We kind of got back together because we were invited by a journalist working for Jewish Currents, who was interested in writing a piece about us, which makes total sense because, we were doing the kind of cultural work that now institutions like Jewish Currents are taking on, right? And coming up with a kind of new political diasporic Jewish identity. So now, of course, coming back, it's like, oh yeah, there's so many people who are kind of, Rokhl, you say like what Scott says in that video seems kind of obvious, but at the time it didn't seem obvious really that much. It seemed like not so obvious to us to say those things. They didn't feel like they were being widely said.
No, that's true. I mean, it's obvious in the sense that it's what occurs to you once you start doing those explorations, right?
Exactly.
Everybody goes through that, like, oh wait, what's going on? Why did this happen? And then once you take those observations into your larger Jewish world, you can feel kind of crazy because they don't see it, and it's very hard to make people see it unless they come into your world and have those series of revelations. Can you talk a little bit more about, and I think these things are connected, but the experience connecting with people at Class Canada, Class Camp? You mentioned a couple of people like Jenny, for example, and she's a really good example of an artist who bridges those worlds of political activism and making Jewish art and teaching within this Jewish world. Jenny is a longtime teacher and theater deviser at Class Canada, for example. Also German, who of blessed memory, who was a wonderful clarinetist and brought this incredible experience and his incredible songbook of hundreds of songs. I'd love to hear a little bit more about that experience, teachers or people that you met or things that came through those experiences that changed the, what you wanted to do or how you were doing it.
I'm going to jump in because I don't have these stories because I never went to those places. And it just occurred to me earlier when Scott was saying, I didn't have any mentors. For me, these two were my mentors because they were gaining the knowledge and I was learning from them. So they can speak to your question, and I can say that for me, it's these two right here who brought it back with them.
But in a weird way, like, I don't know, I'm going to go out on a limb here. Like I went to Class Camp once and Class Canada once, and I'm very excited to go back to Class Canada to teach theater this summer. That's going to be cool. But in a way, like, I feel like I soaked up a kind of ambiance and got the feeling of what it was like to play this music. But then my experience was this project went on its own trajectory. And like, we were then doing our own research, as they say now. And we were kind of, on our own, but not in a bad way. Like it allowed us to kind of like be a pressure cooker of an original sound, so that definitely we came out of that educational milieu, but then we went on our own we went on our own pathway. I don't know, Scott, does that resonate at all?
Yeah, no, it's really true. I think we, I don't entirely know why, but it's like we were kind of willfully peripheral. You know, we could have tried to be more integrated, but it was not, I don't know what, it was part of the cultural moment. I think part of it also was that, I mean, well, quite literally, our politics were further to the left than I think most of the community was at the time. And I don't think that people were as comfortable with some of the positions that we were taking against the occupation. And even though much of it, I think, was intrinsic to Yiddish. I mean, part of the whole idea of some of the more rabble-rousing songs was that Yiddish has this rich vocabulary, Yiddish poetry, Yiddish literature, Yiddish songs, this rich vocabulary of like opposing militarism and nationalism. I mean, if you go through Baragovsky, it's like half of course, this was self-selected because it's a Soviet book, but half of them are like songs about being forced into the Tsar's army to fight the capitalist wars. And it's talking about just how brutal and horrible it is. And if you have this whole musical vocabulary that's about like condemning political violence and nationalism, how could you not turn that to what was happening with, I mean, we're in 2004, right? We're talking, there's like the Iraq War, there's the Second Intifada, I mean, you name it. And so I think we had a bit of a, like for us, it was also a bit of an identity crisis of like, how do we engage with Jewish culture at a time when politically it's pretty problematic and there was not a lot of self-awareness and there was a real disconnect between, you know, being liberal or progressive and sort of some of the very ugly things happening in the name of the Jewish state. But even beyond that, I mean, I think like mainstream Judaism in North America has become so much more progressive, egalitarian than in the late 90s and early 2000s. So, I mean, I really do feel like there's been a big cultural shift, which, to go back to the question, you know, playing this music again in 2022 is like, it's a whole different thing. And like I have explained to people I know through like my local synagogue, and it's conservative and it's pretty darn mainstream, right? But you know, I can talk to like people, and I can talk to local rabbis about what we did and what we did back then and what the songs are about and what our new record is about. And people don't bat an eye. They're just like, okay, I can situate you where you are now in the Jewish spectrum. And that's like, you're inside the tent now. Whereas I think back then it was like, no. You're very much outside the tent.
Or even if like a lot of musicians were, you know, politically progressive, and a lot of them were, and like cultural workers and so on, the institutions themselves were quite conservative at the time.
For sure. Jessica,
Yeah.
did you want to say something before?
I just wanted to, am I muted? No. I just wanted to say that I was just maybe thinking about putting ourselves outside of the system of klezmer even, what you were saying, like I went there once, we went there once, and then we had this feeling that we were apart still. And I think that the other piece of that puzzle is that we all sort of played in this kind of punk rock scene, and we knew that there were other avenues to go that we were all interested in. And we also knew that we didn't want to be in a klezmer revival band. We wanted to take this music and make it our own and our musical influences. And Terry and I were touring all the time with Mount Zion, and there was this other path that was open to us that I think set us apart again. That was like, we were the only Jewish band on this path, and we had these ideas of how things could sound that didn't exist yet, I think, because of our various influences and musicians, I think is what I think that's the part we haven't talked about so much, is the actual musicians in us that sort of striving to create something that didn't exist with all of the reasons that we're talking about.
Well, I want to get more to the new album, but you know, I want to talk about the writing of the new album, or maybe also before that, if you want to speak a little bit more to the impetus behind it, like the kind of unusual circumstances. And I'd love to hear more about the music. And you know, you guys, you know, include a lot of different instrumentation, and it's really a beautiful, like gorgeous sound. You know, there's a lot of punk sort of in the background, but the result sonically, you know, even if there was, you know, distorted violin and whatever, like the sound is still gorgeous. It's very inviting, you know, it doesn't resist listening. So let's talk a little bit about the new album and how that happens.
I'm not going to go first because I tend to take, I know we have very limited time now and I take too long to say things. So you guys go.
Well, just to very briefly say, we did get asked to do this interview for a feature in Jewish Currents, which in the end never materialized, but that did get us talking on Zoom in the early months of the pandemic, you know, at a moment when, you know, we were all kind of trapped in our homes. And I would say, like, for all of us, this experience of being in this band was so meaningful and powerful. Like, it had left us such a mark on us, you know, in terms of our lives as human beings and as artists or intellectuals or lawyers or whatever, you know, that the idea of talking again was really exciting. And then we did start talking. We just had this kind of like really powerful, you know, series of conversations amongst ourselves, you know, working through what had happened back in the first days of playing together. And then Scott started, you know, sending around some voice memos that just kind of blew our minds, and we're like, whoa, this is different music than we played before. It had a different vibe, different feeling, but yet, you know, completely still in our worldview. So that was really exciting.
Scott, what was in those voice memos? What was it? Piano? Was it melodies? Was it words?
Yeah, it was piano. I mean, I did not play music for years. I became a lawyer, and I you know, we lived on the West Coast for a while, and I just during the pandemic was out of the blue, just had the idea of, what if I started playing piano again? I haven't played piano since I was a little kid, but just as something different, and a way to reapproach music, because every time that I picked up an instrument, sort of between 2006 and 2020, I was just right back in Montreal, and I was like frozen in time, and I couldn't make anything new on it. And it was a really jarring, almost kind of traumatic experience. And so I was just like, look, I can't do that. I can't handle picking up a guitar and being right there in this world that doesn't exist for me anymore. But when we started talking again as a band, it was just, I had just happened to get a piano. And so I was able to just sit down and start playing, and I don't know how it happened, just something unlocked in me, and thinking about Black Ox and thinking about reconnecting with really my friends in the band. It was a very personal moment. And so I think in a way that the record is more, I don't know if personal is the right word, but it's kind of more introspective and emotional than well, just different emotions, I think. It's less of a statement, or there's more like ambiguity in it. And I think a lot of it is more kind of an exploration of kind of like the emotional, like, what is it in your personality and your social connections that leads you to adopt ethical views or adopt political views and take that political position? And it's less about articulating like, down with X, Y, and Z. It's more about how do we, and sort of reflecting on it at a later stage of life, like how are we able to do that? How are we able to like muster that? And maybe it's just that we had chutzpah, or maybe not. But what is it that drives you to take political positions and to find a spark in someone else that inspires you to do that? And so I think that was kind of a bit more of the place that I was in when I started writing the songs. And you know, so some of the songs are thinking about refugees. So for example, Mizrach Mimara was the first one that I wrote. And it was a reflection on some of the work that I've done as a human rights lawyer with Syrian refugees, and in particular, working with people that had fled from Syria into Turkey and then into Germany, and thinking about how it's sort of the reverse flow of people of deportees from France to Germany during the Second World War, and thinking about this sort of convergence in Berlin as the sort of representing the savior now, 21st century, a savior for like 1 million Syrian refugees relocated to Germany, whereas it meant something very different just a few decades ago. And just thinking about that and the historicity of it, and the transformations, and how like one generation could speak to another, and feeling like, well, that's what this music is all about. And that's part of what is so interesting about klezmer music and diaspora music, is that it's capable of bridging and finding cross-pollinating meanings between different historical movements and different populations. And it just sort of clicked. It was like, that's what happens when you reconnect with people that taught you, like our mentors, and shared visions with you and are sources of inspiration. And when you connect that with your political beliefs and your ethics, and you say, that's the source of creativity, and that's the source of what's good in this world, despite the revival of fascism and climate change and everything that's horrible out there, and the pandemic and everything that was looming over us and still is.
Something that's also very interesting to me about the new album is that it's not just sort of introspective in a new way, that's different than the previous two albums, but that there's a sort of quiet playfulness about it, that the writing, the lyrics, the interplay of languages, I found so lovely and playful in its own way. And that's also, just makes it a very enjoyable listen.
That's interesting. That's funny because playful is not the word that jumps to mind when I think about the record, but I think you're right. I mean, it's part of it, and it's working with limitations. Like, I feel like my Yiddish is extremely rusty. It was at its best, it was Yivo Yiddish with like a weird smattering of my mom's like idioms. And so I felt like I literally am not going to be able to compose full lyrics in Yiddish for the most part. And maybe I don't need to, because that's not really what Yiddish is. That's not what it means for us. It's, if you have a few snippets of Yiddish coupled with some Hebrew, coupled with English, you can create something from that. And that felt more true and authentic to who I am now as someone trying to write music about, about life and kind of who we are as a band, of not being a Yiddish revival band. And so, but it was scary. I mean, the first few times when I was like, guys, I have a song in English. I was like, what? I was like terrified to sort of share this, because it was like, is this still Black Ox? Is it still Black Ox if it's in English? Or if there's like snippets of French in it? I mean, this is not something that we would have done in 2004. But there is an element of playing, but it's more just sort of making do with what you have.
But it doesn't come across in a, sort of janky way. I mean, it comes across as very authentic, which is why I think it works. I
would just say, I'm going to interrupt just for a second, just to say that what Scott's describing, I think, is what in different ways true for all of us, just on a musical level as well. All of us are 20 years older. And so all of us have had this sort of, as one does, a softening of what makes you feel hardcore when you're in your 20s. Then your life happens to you and kids, and like just getting through it all and realizing that we don't have that anymore. None of us do. We can't, but we have instead other things, and we've let other things come in. So there's other influences in our life, and I suppose in some ways musically a softening and a playfulness as well. Whereas once upon a time we might have refused certain types of the production on the record. That's not dirty enough, it's not cool enough. But now as people who sort of come all the way through all the things we've come through musically, can be like, actually it is authentic, it is true, and we can be soft as well, and we can be all of these things, and it is still Black Ox because it's the four of us and our true selves.
I actually had a question for you, Jessica, before we listen to one of the tracks from one of the next tracks that I think we had planned. I'm curious if your family had a reaction, because you said that, you come from a family where there was a lot of Yiddish around, and your relatives were involved in Jewish education. Did they have a reaction to you working with Yiddish and Jewish musical idioms? And what was their reaction to the way it turned out?
It is a good question. I don't have, it's funny because I know that at least my dad is here. Hi, Dad. So, but our whole familial relationship with Judaism was so non-religious. And I think that it was more perplexed, like, why would you, in a way? Why would you want to do this of all things? But at the same time, the fact that Gabe and I could now at Hanukkah parties pull out our instruments and actually play these tunes was like very loved and appreciated. But the direction, I think the direction of me personally from my family, the direction of Black Ox was as sort of like perplexing as the direction of my other bands. Is like, that's not pretty. That's not, but you know, appreciated, but not in a sort of negative or positive way, just sort of curiosity.
I mean, you know, you could imagine that on the one hand, families might be excited if you're working with Yiddish, you're doing something with Yiddish, you're learning it, but you're taking it in this direction that's not, you know, Ruth Rubin, it's not Barry Sisters, it's not the things that people might expect. And I think it can take time to sort of adjust your expectations and create a new understanding of what Yiddish can be or sound like. Yeah, Gabe, did you want to say something?
I mean, I just think that at the same time, just like, I mean, I think when I see your family now at the shows, you know, they're just like bursting with nachas, you know, it's just like the most,
now. Yes.
Yeah, it's just
Black
like the
Ox
most amazing thing, you know, that, oh my gosh,
absolutely.
you know, my kid is like doing Jewish culture, like in this way, in a public way. It's just, there's a lot of pride and excitement there for sure. You know, also like our family milieus are, you know, I wouldn't say bohemian exactly, but certainly like very culturally sophisticated. And, you know, there's family members who are theater directors and philosophers and, you know, people who are involved in the arts in one way or another. So they were excited.
I think that
I feel like we should skip the video at this point because I mean, our actual end time is in like 2 minutes.
Oh,
We
I
could go.
I thought we were going for an hour and a half.
I think we should, but I wonder if that's okay with everybody. Can we go till 4:30?
Let's put we'd love everyone to watch this video. We'll put a link somewhere where people can see it so that we could finish this conversation, right? Also, the video seems to not be working very well. So
Yeah.
But are these questions popping up?
Lots of questions. I'm just going to put them in. I'm going to put them as answered, not to say that we're answering them, but just to just so that everybody can see them because they're such great questions. I mean, I think yeah, I don't know, Rokhl, do you want to take this in any particular direction right now?
I thought it would be nice to hear a little bit more of the music.
So why don't we hear just a little bit of Mizrach Mima'ariv, which is Ma'arav, sorry, which is the song that Scott mentioned, which was actually what you hear is a voice memo that Scott circulated with me adding clarinet in my basement and then Jessica and Terry adding violin and bass in the studio, like in the middle of the pandemic, before we'd gotten back together in person. So this is like musically a pandemic virtual collaboration. And then the visuals for this, the video is by Eric Ruin, who's a wonderful artist from Philadelphia, who I know from the kind of puppet theater world, who we got to do the video. So Sandra, let's play maybe just a couple of minutes of Mizrach Mima'arav from that minute 50 mark.
ذكرينا قفينا نصلنا العم قفينا ينزيزي قفينا تنقرينا قفاينا تنقرينا قفاينا Deputacja hebt ons ek se zeker. Auf Vauxhall Kintraige. Direct החזגלח. ממערב למזרח. בסרגל וסטרוגן. Wir Protest sorgen. Besser Flight wie Fight. So die Geschichte beschließen. Just listen, listen. Zum Gründen gefeuern. Wieder geweuern. Ungeeignet gefeuert.
Great, thanks, Sandra. Such a beautiful video. Thank you, Eric. I just want to say, what an amazing, accompaniment to that song.
I would love you guys to take a stab at Isabel's question here, which I think is really interesting. Isabel is also herself a wonderful musician from Austria. She's in the United States right now, and also is very much makes politics and political history part of her musical project, specifically Bundes history, but other kinds of Yiddish history too. And she asks, how would you say your engagement with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and opposition to the occupation changed in your current musical practice from the early 2000s? How does this part of your activism inform your music making today?
It's a really excellent question, and it's kind of hard to articulate in a way, but I don't know. Scott, do you want me to take this question or do you want to take a stab at it?
I mean, I can take a stab at part of it. I think that, it's part of it is that it's a different time. And I think that I think we all kind of had a sense in 2001 when we were writing that, that it was kind of like, I don't know what, breaking new ground. We're saying something that really was taboo. And my feeling now is less that it is no less urgent to be speaking out against ethno-nationalism and violence and fascism, whether it's in Israel or elsewhere. But it's slightly less taboo to do so. And so I think maybe personally I kind of have a sense of like, we did that earlier on, and I don't know that we need to do the same thing or even could do the same thing now. I also, personally work as a human rights lawyer and, was, I think, partly looking at sort of almost how do we sustain that impulse, as opposed to like, yes, you can articulate it, especially when you're young and fearless and you have no attachments in the world. And if institutions have, cracked down on you, you have less to lose. But part of it beyond that is also just how do you sustain it? How do you sustain it throughout your life? How do you sustain a commitment to justice? And And so in a weird way, some of the introspection, I think, of the new record is a little bit more focused on that, on like, what is it that keeps you going? What is it that helps you, whether you are a victim or a survivor of trauma or somebody trying to respond to trauma or traumatic violence and intervene and prevent it, or, you know, shout it down? What is it that sustains you through that? So I think part of the meaning of the record and the engagement is a little bit more cryptic, and it's sort of elliptical. Maybe in a more direct sense, it's like it's just explicitly anti-fascist at moments. And I think part of it is also saying, in a way that I think actually a lot of the Jewish liberal mainstream has now caught up with us, in saying this is what's happening in Israel is also an expression of like a transnational fascist movement. And it's no, you know, it's no shock that you see, you know, right-wing Zionists demonstrating in Israel waving Confederate flags. Or you see Netanyahu's son out there like buddying with, you know, with like alt-right figures and the Trump progeny. It's part of a transnational movement that we have an obligation to oppose everywhere around the world as people that love humanity and don't believe that people should be persecuted and discriminated against and suffer violence.
Well put.
Gabe, Jessica, did you want to say anything else?
I think that's fair to say. I mean, I think we were sensitive. I mean, you know, it's I don't want to say we were so self-oriented as a band, but I think, you know, we also felt like reuniting. There's a kind of little precious spark that we're struggling to keep lit at this point with this project. It's quite challenging. Like Jessica and Terry, just to clarify, Jessica and Terry live in Montreal doing their individual projects. Scott's in Washington, DC. I'm in Toronto. You know, we can gather a couple times a year maybe to make music together, which feels so sad in a way. Like I feel like I've suffered from that a lot this past year, even like so much work on this record, promoting it, planning the tour, and then we just get a little time together, you know? So in that sense, I think like we can, you know, I still feel like politically active as an individual, like outside of the band, you know, and involved in some interesting, you know, critical left-wing Jewish communities in Toronto here, associated with like the Morris Winchevsky School and Camp Nivelt and Ujpo and so on. But I don't feel like the band has to carry that weight right now, because we also want to keep playing together and keep making music. You know, that's really the precious goal here, you know? Yeah.
So just to sort of wrap up, do you have any thoughts, you know, now having gone through this process of coming back together to make this album, to play all these shows, do you have any thoughts about, you know, what has happened over the last 20 years in terms of the band, what you guys created, you know, looking back, what came out of it, you know, sort of any thoughts there on these last 2 decades and where you might go in the future? Although, you know, who knows, like things can always happen, right? Like strange turns of events.
For me, I unlike these guys, like I never went also in a professional direction outside of music. So I've been living in this world in one way or another consistently, and touring with bands for years and years and years. And then the last 7 years, mostly touring by myself. And of all the records that I've made, and there are many at this point, the 2 Black Ox records would sort of nestled in my heart as probably my favorite project ever, and with great sadness that it had to end when it ended for all the reasons that it did. And touring with my main band for all those years from Silver and Zion, and then touring alone, like consistently on every tour, I would have people come to me and say, those records, I still listen to them. Those records are amazing. Will you guys ever play music again? So even though there was this huge gap and all of the sort of complicated interpersonal stuff that comes with gaps and comes with different lives and everything that we've lived through, there was this like, it's like, yeah, I don't know how to say it else except that I had like this tiny dream. I always had this tiny dream that these 4 people could play music again together. So that's the through line for me. And making this record was such an, like, I couldn't believe it when all the stars aligned such that the 4 of us met over Zoom to talk before we did this big interview. And it was the first time the 4 of us had been in one place, even though we were not geographically in one place, but the weird timing of the fact that for all of a sudden everybody knew what Zoom was, and all of a sudden like talking like this wasn't completely abnormal as it was pre-2020. It was like, what even is Zoom? I'd never heard of it. But I guess me also just having not had a professional life, like I just wasn't used to this kind of thing, but it opened all these doors for us, and I couldn't be more thrilled that it happened. But like also like Gabe said, it's really hard, unlike when we were last together, when our lives was about making music together, and it felt really complicated at the time, but now we can laugh that was complicated. Now it's just contending with lives and kids and everything that we have. So yeah, I think what Gabe said about if we could just be so lucky as to focus on making music, that would be a gift.
Diana.
Well, maybe unless you guys have more to say on that note, I think that's kind of a nice place to end it, you know, that things are difficult, but also incredibly rewarding and worth doing too. So thank you so much. Thank you for coming together, for asking me to host. Thank you for this new album. It's just really lovely and such a wonderful listen. And I hope anybody who's here who hasn't listened to the whole thing, you should listen to it.
Please do it. And Rokhl, thank you so much for agreeing to do this. And thanks for your gracious hosting. You've been marvelous.
And thanks to York University for making this happen.
And let me just say thanks to Glendon campus, because we got to specify, and to the Center for Research on Language and Culture Contact, which is the research unit at Glendon, which is just the perfect research unit for this kind of conversation. So thanks, Aurelia, and to the whole team there for making this happen.
Okay, and amazingly, pretty much everybody stuck with us for the whole hour and a half. So, wow, okay, fantastic. Everybody have a great rest of the day, and hopefully at some time soon, we'll come back together and hear more music from you guys, okay?
Absolutely. Thanks everyone.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Bye-bye.